Right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our fifth Sundowner webinar in our series. We have a very exciting lineup for you, or speaker for you this evening, Mrs. Navashini Govender. She is a conservation manager from the Kruger National Park, and she focuses on fire as a tool for ecosystem management, developing fire policies, implementation of fire plans, monitoring and decision support systems for the Greater Kruger National Park. She is also co-chair of the Southern African Fire Network, serves as the Fire Protection Officer for the Greater Kruger Fire Protection Association, and is a research associate at the Nelson Mandela University. Mrs. Govender has approximately 20 years experience as a Savannah fire ecologist in South Africa, mainly burning in the Kruger National Park, with working on fire and the expanded public works program in South Africa. So as before, Navashini will give her presentation, and then Untitled Keys will take over and handle the question and answer session. If you can please post your questions in the chat box, and we will deal with him during the question and answer session. So Navashini, welcome. Thank you very much for your time to speak to us on this webinar, and I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Let me start sharing my screen. How's that?
That's
sorry, I'm just...
No problem. It just needs to go into the slide note view. Okay, we are seeing the technique. That's it. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
So, thank you. So, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me at this webinar. Firstly, I'd like to thank the GSSA for giving me this platform to share my experiences and some learnings that we have with fire. So I would like to discuss fire in savannas and grassland, and actually a necessary evil. So we know that rangelands occur worldwide and in the variety of forms, from grasslands, shrublands, to savannas, to open woodlands. But in these systems is fire. Often fire is referred to as a wicked problem, an evil, or a destructive force, and often perceived as negative, and therefore usually is suppressed. But, or is fire, should we consider fire that has complex issues, is necessary a tool within the rangelands and savannas and grasslands? So this is how most people see fires, something that is very destructive and harmful. But would we blame people actually when your life and your livelihoods and family is threatened by fire? But in Africa's savannas and our grasslands, we see fire often as a tool that allows us for cleaning up our landscape of moribund material, dead moribund material, that provide new grazing and fresh grazing, rejuvenate the landscape. And it also is a tool that we can now use to convert our wooded areas to more open grasslands. So we think this is a very important and an advantageous management tool that we have at our disposal. So we do know that our African savannas are complex and dynamic systems, and that they are characterized by the co-dominance of trees and grasses. And the availability of water nutrients, water, and herbivory actually control the percentage of trees and grasses, and fire is a key driver shaping that system. So recently we've come across this phenomenon that's taking place that is actually been termed or coined as the death of savannahs. And we see this taking place when we look at areas from fixed point photographs. And here we have Shishluwi-Ampolosi Reserve, 1956 to 2012. And you can see that the area is extremely wooded from what it previously was. Even in our drier landscapes in the country, we look at the Karoo, the same phenomenon is taking place. and areas that are previously grasslands or dominated by grasslands are now becoming much more wooded. And reasons for this is very often attributed to an increase in carbon dioxide and also inappropriate land management actions, namely the suppression of fires. So why is this actually very important for us, or we should take cognizance of this, is because now Africa is actually the last home for our mega herbivore fauna. In other areas, they become extinct. And in order to have these, our megafauna, we need savanna and grassland landscapes. That's in Africa, that's where our ecotourism also takes place. So having this phenomenon take place is quite a negative interaction. During my talk, I would like to chat about some fire interactions, looking at rainfall, herbivory, the legislation, fire and people, climate change, specifically with reference to a fire danger index, and then fire and carbon sequestration. So I will go through these step by step. When you look at fire and rainfall interactions, we know that in our wet years, we have a lot more grass being produced. Our herbivores cannot consume all the grasses, and therefore fire acts as a generalist herbivores and have much bigger role. In our drier years, we have herbivores that can consume the grasses, and therefore fire plays less of a role in the landscape during our dry years. We really looked at this relationship between rainfall and area burnt in 6 other protected areas in South Africa, ranging across a rainfall gradient from about 380 mils to about 956. And we saw that the relationship held true and still was available, but the relationship strength appears to decrease as rainfall increases. But using the preceding 2 years' rainfall is a very good predictor of how much needs to burn in a current fire season. When you're managing fire in the Kruger National Park, or many other protected areas in Africa, you have to really consider the effects of fire and herbivory interactions. And we know that the feeding behavior of our mega herbivores also influence fire patterns and effects that we see in the landscape. I'd like to bring your attention to a series of photographs that I have here. This is a 54-year management exposure that is in Kruger National Park. This is 1985, a picture that was taken. The area in the background is a fenced area, and the foreground is unfenced. So this is 1985. This is 1995, the photograph, fixed point photograph of the same area. Here's 2005. And finally in 2015, and you can see that the landscape has changed significantly in the background, the area that has been fenced. And that's because it has been fenced off. There was no access to herbivory by elephants in there, but there was fire regime being practiced in both areas that was very similar. So you can see that when you have managing an area with fire and herbivory, one really needs to take into account the interaction of these two drivers before deciding on a fire management plan. If you look at another experiment that we have, a long-term fire experiment in the Kruger National Park, this is a 67-year-old experiment, you can see that the area on the right, which is exposed to fire, where fire is pulled out of the system, and the area on the left of the picture where fire is put into the system. But herbivores do have access to both areas. And what we can see is that significant changes in the structure of the vegetation in there, species composition and density is still the same, but really significant is the woody cover that's changed between the two areas, as well as the availability of the different heights or structure diversity between the two areas. Now, when you move on to our herbivores and their role in the interaction with fire, we know that grazing lawns are a very important microbiome that we have in our landscape. They have a very different suite of fauna and flora that have and housed on these grazing lawns, but they also do play a role in affecting our fire patterns in the landscape. But recently, I would like to chat about the role that white rhinos play and what we have been experiencing in the Kruger National Park. And we know that our white rhino populations from about the 1960s in Kruger National Park increased very, very slowly. But from about 2000, we saw a rapid increase in our white rhino population, and that had significant effects on the way the fire burns and the patterns that we were seeing. And really, it was in 2000 that we started actually having a very much an active burning program in the Kruger National Park. We came from an era of just allowing lightning fires to burn, but in 2000 we started actively putting fires into the Kruger National Park, and we saw this increase in white rhino. But recently, from about 2010, and what we're currently dealing with is the effects of poaching, and we are seeing a decrease in our white rhino numbers. And there has been an significant investment into anti-poaching in the last 10 years, amounting to billions of rands. But we are seeing that there are really consequences and been expensive for biodiversity conservation, as well as our rangers' social well-being and safety. So actually, we are now considering to rethink the way we are approaching the poaching situation in the Kruger National Park, where we are now going to focus on the actual asset, and that means our rhinos and guarding our rhinos, investing into protecting cows, because if we then save a cow, you save the reproduction potential of that animal as well as the subsequent cows. Investing in rhino conservation and not just anti-poaching. But one of the key elements that we are going to address now is to look at the habitat management, because if you want to have healthy populations, you need to provide good forage quality and quantity. And we are seeing that burning is a tool that can address that. So what is the consequence of actually reducing fires in our landscape? We're seeing an increase in wooded habitats, and we have seen that. You will see a decrease in our forage quality and quantity. We're seeing a decrease in our herbivores numbers. This will be a decrease in our predators, ecotourism in our parks, and therefore KNP is negatively affected, African savannas, and then our megafauna, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and ultimately our economy, because our savanna landscapes are instrumental in providing socioeconomic development for a lot of communities around our areas. So in order to facilitate this, we feel that, and it has to be led from much higher up, and in many countries, actually setting fires is criminalized. The legislation does not allow for us to set fires. And if you are caught setting fires, it's a criminal offense. So we need to show that national legislation supports the setting of fires. And in South Africa, currently, our legislation does not allow for prescribed burning except for fire breaks. And we are in a process of making these amendments because we recognize that prescribed fires is really important for fuel reduction and also for having high intensity burns for ecological reasons. So a feeling is that if legislation does not support it, it's very difficult to get people on the ground or managers to start setting fires. Fire protection associations in South Africa is a very important vehicle to try and get our communities and different landowners chatting to each other. It is compulsory that all government agencies and parastatals form fire protection associations, and there's actually very good reasons to do that. The legal obligations, you secure one's boundaries, you have trained staffs, you have appropriate equipment and PPE, and ultimately you are dealing and reducing the fire risk in an area. But what is really important is that fire protection associations allows people with a common interest from different land uses talking about fire. So that has been very, very good. When we look at fire and people, we know in Africa, fire is still linked to people's livelihoods and the economy and social well-being. Our African landscape, our fauna, flora, and the ecosystems are shaped, sustained, and actually dependent on fire, and it's necessary. However, man's ability to manipulate fire has increased over time. But what elements in the fire regime can man influence? And we know that one of these elements is that of season and time of day, and the intensity of fire, and how hot these fires burn. And that has important implications for fire intensity, the tree task dynamics, and now for greenhouse gas emissions. We have been able to show that we can, as managers, influence the season and intensity of fires, and I'll show you data that supports that. But deciding on how much we need to burn, we have shown in the Kruger National Park that we are unable to influence that. And really, that is influenced by the preceding 2 years' rainfall. So the more rain you have, the more grass you have, and therefore the more fires you have. So that is an element of the fire regime that we are unable to influence. It is also the variability in the fire regime or the interfire fire return period that is also controlled by rainfall. And I have mentioned that we've shown that we can, as managers, influence the intensity or hot fires burn, that irrespective of when we said that we will have different management strategies, we were able to shift from more medium and lower fire intensities into high fire intensities. And if this is the element of the fire regime that we as managers can influence, I believe that we need to start actively playing a role in and influencing that and implementing fires of particular intensities in achieving our objective. When we look at fire and the size of fire specifically and people, we looked at a project in the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Park, and we compared the actual experiment and the research that we looked at was to look at the two different fire management strategies in both these parks. In Kruger National Park, we have a very structured and intensive fire management policy, more attributed to a command and control. There's a long history of fire research that really influences the policy. We have less than 1,000 people in the Kruger National Park, and we use fire as an ecological tool. When you look across the boundary or the fence into Limpopo National Park, we can look at that policy and how fires are implemented. It's very unstructured, hands-off, very laissez-faire. Fire research is very much in its infancy. There is still more than 8,000 people still along the Xingwetsi and in the Limpopo National Park. And often fire is used to sustain one's livelihood in the area as well as an ecological tool. So very, very different management strategies. But how do these different management strategies influence or affect the size of fires? So we looked at that and we saw that the Kruger National Park actually had a much larger percentage of large fires, greater than 2,500 hectares. And this was very, very unexpected results because the Kruger National Park has a network of fire breaks that we expected or hypothesized that would stop these fires or form boundaries to fire scars. But we found that there was a greater diversity of fire sizes in the Limpopo National Park. And this finding was also supported by Archibald et al. In 2009, where she showed that on a much larger scale in Southern Africa, fire sizes decrease with increasing human use of the landscape. Okay, so now when we look at fire and climate change, specifically on the effects that fires have or climate change is having on the fire danger index, in the recent drought that we've had in the Kruger National Park, 2015-2016 drought, we compared the day temperatures, the number of days that we had above 35 degrees. And you can see when we compare that to the 91-92 drought, which was previously the worst drought on KNP's record, we had more than almost double that amount of days. So we had 74 days that were greater than 35 degrees in 91-92. But in 2015-2016, we had 136 days. We took this analysis a bit further and we looked at the number of days that had greater than 40 degrees in Skukuza. And these are very, very uncomfortable days, I must say. So in 1991-92, we had 7 days that were greater than 40 degrees. And in 2015-2016, we had 29 days, more than 3 times that. And this has really significant effects on the fire danger index. And what this is showing us that with an increase in temperature, as we are moving on, we are seeing days that are more red days. And these are days that we are likely to have wildfires. And these wildfires that take place on these days are really something that we need to try and manage, understand, see how we can utilize to our benefits. But this is really what's happening. We're seeing an increase in the number of red days where we would have wildfires. So changes in the fire intensity to reduce carbon emission. Now, this is something that has been really tried in many areas to increase the early season cooler fires, to reduce the later season hotter fires. And it's very often referred to as patch mosaic burning. It has been implemented successfully in Pilanesberg National Park, Kakadu National Park, in Arnhem Land in Australia. And these areas, especially in Australia, they use them to earn carbon credits. In Kruger, however, we are using this to influence the fire intensity, and more specifically on our basalts, is to reduce the loss of tall trees that we are seeing on our basalt areas in the Kruger National Park. But as I said, as a manager, if fire intensity or when we burn, the day of burn, is something that we can influence, we need to actively go out and do that. Now, when we start looking at climate change and carbon sequestration, we often see, or we are now experiencing, the Western ideologies of reforestation, of degraded lands for carbon credits. Now, we have a number of these programs out there, something, the Bond Challenge, where there's pledges for 150 million hectares to be planted by 2020, 350 million hectares by 2030. Africa has signed up to the AFR 100, where we are contributing 100 million hectares by 2030, and other campaigns, that's the UN Trillion Tree Campaign. So these are campaigns that now encourage the planting of trees in order to offset carbon emissions or to act as carbon sinks. But what is really unnerving and very, very worrying about these programs is that areas such as the Kruger National Park and the Serengeti are actually classed as degraded landscapes, despite them being ancient grasslands. So these are the areas that are earmarked for reforestation or to rehabilitate degraded lands. And then what is also very worrying is that the species that is promoted to grow in these landscapes, these eucalypts and pines, these are rapidly growing species. And areas such as the Drakensberg, which is often referred to as the water tower in South Africa, we see that these are high rainfall areas and are very resistant to soil erosion. These areas are also earmarked for reforestation. When you look at the countries that have pledged to make these reforested areas, you can see that they are really from developing countries. The 29 from America is actually dominated by countries from Latin America. So it is very worrying that landscapes such as the Kruger National Park are deemed necessary for reforestation or are degraded and have to be reclaimed or rehabilitated. So the benefits of this reforestation for reducing global warming is very poorly supported by science. There are a lot of costs, there are extensive land transformation that takes place. The actual gains in carbon sequestration is very small. We know that there are huge biodiversity losses, but they are actually not acknowledged or they are even ignored. And there is extreme reduction in stream flow and the loss of resilient water resources. Now, when you start planting species such as eucalypts and pines, we can see there's an increase in fire frequency, the intensities, you get a lot of out-of-season fires. This is what has been recently experienced in the Knysna areas, the fires that we've had there. There's often loss of native vegetation, increase in soil erosion, and you actually increase the risk to the lives of people and their property. So in conclusion, fires in savannas and grasslands is indeed a necessary evil, but not because it is a tool that is unwanted, but because of its complexity, the necessity to have this tool in our system to maintain savannas and grasslands, and we really need to consider the interaction with other drivers. Our landscapes and people have evolved with fire. We have lived with fire. We've managed fire for millennia. So what we need to call on now is the rest of the world. The question is, can they do that? And I would like to say thank you and look forward to questions.
Navashini, thank you very much for that. Ntatuko, are you ready to take questions and answers?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much, Navashini. And Navashini, thanks a lot for such a wonderful, informative presentation. Colleagues, we have now entered the question and answer session. And we have exactly, is it 25 minutes, Debbie? Is it 25 minutes or 30 minutes that we have?
Yes, we've got half an hour for questions.
Half an hour for questions. And maybe let me just remind everyone and recap on the rules of this game now. Earlier on, we had asked people to post their questions, and I've seen that some people have done so, and we're grateful to them. And if you have not posted your question, you're encouraged to post your question on the chat box. Then I'll read the questions out to Navashini for her to respond. And if you would like also to engage Navashini directly through asking questions or making comments, you are also welcome to raise your hand, and we can then unmute your mic and you can directly engage with her. So the first question comes from Good stuff, Nick Leroy, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm sorry if I'm not. The question is reading as follows, Navashini. The Holistic Management Group sees fire as waste of usable grazing and browsing material. Can the selective grazing or browsing effect be removed by increasing stocking rates? And can increasing resting periods be used to replace fire as a management tool? I don't know if I should continue with the question. A third part of it is or whether this is only applicable to livestock systems and not in wildlife systems where fire is a non-negotiable effect management tool in savannas, grassland, and fynbos. I hope you got the question, or should I repeat it?
Yeah, shall I take those two questions and then we can move on?
Please, yes.
Okay, to answer the second one, I think, a lot of the work that I've presented on is really in protected areas where there is no domestic grazing, just wildlife grazing. And also the Kruger National Park is an order of magnitude in size. So, the one question to look at grazing as an option to assist with bush encroachment, yes, that is an option. But on the scale of the Kruger National Park or protected areas, fire seems to be the more cost-effective tool that we need to look at rather than grazing. But definitely on smaller landscapes or farms or areas, grazing can be used as a tool. I mean, the work done by Winston Trollope in the Eastern Cape on his experiment, where we're seeing bush taking place and reduction of grazing land. The best combination is fire and goats. And if you can burn back the vegetation, top kill it, you don't kill the vegetation, but then you see a reduction in wood encroachment once you bring goats in to grazing. So yes, fire and grazing by domestic areas is certainly an option. And if used correctly, that can be very, very successful. But in the Kruger National Park, it is not an option. Fire seems to be the more cost-effective tool to combat bush thickening.
So is that peculiar to Kruger National Park because it's Kruger National Park, or just wild, or can you generalize and say wildlife systems?
No, I think it is wildlife system. I think it's really dependent on the size of the area you're managing. I think if you have small farms or game farms of 1,000 hectares, yes, grazing in combination with fire can be utilized. So it's really dependent on the size of the area that you are managing. So as you get bigger, it becomes more cost effective and more successful if you use fire. But as you get smaller, you can use both.
Okay. She went on to, I think you have already addressed this one, but she didn't just read it to be fair to her. She also continued to ask if the combination of fire and grazing or browsing interaction of young trees following fire is not an option to control and slow down bush encroachment rate. You partly addressed this, yes.
Yes, it is an option, but it really depends. We don't manage where the herbivores graze. We're now trying to test out on the size of burns. So if you burn areas of 1,000 hectares compared to 500 hectares, you may be able to concentrate the grazers to have a greater effect rather than having 2,000 hectares or larger areas burns where you dilute the effect of the grazing. So really to manage this, you have to look at the size of the area and then decide on how you're going to utilize fire and herbivory as a tool to manage bush encroachment.
Okay, now thanks for that response. Another question comes from Tessia Stradom, and it reads as follows. You reflected on high FDI, I think it's the fire danger index, if I'm not mistaken, days that are higher than 40 degrees, but your graph only shows the wet season month when field is green. So has high fuel moisture content and when humidity is high, shouldn't you rather reflect on more than 40 degrees Celsius days or high FDI days during the peak fire season, where the possibility of high intensity fires are much greater? I hope you got this one. I was a bit...
Yeah, no, I can see it. Fine.
Okay.
So yes, indeed. I mean, we think that was just to show you a trend of increasing number of days in height of more than 40 degrees. So yes, we are seeing that. And what you did pick up is that it is in the growing season. And for me, actually, we want those high intensity burns and red days in the growing season, because with the bush thickening species that we have in the Kruger National Park, our indigenous species, we seem to have a greater effect with high intensity burns in the growing season. So actually having those wildfires, although they're not very fun to manage, and if we can sustain them in the growing seasons, that would be good if we can have that. But if we're getting high intensity or more FDI days in the wet season, I'm sure we're getting that in the dry season, and that would be what, as a fireman, would be more of concern. I mean, we can drill down to the data and look at it, but there was just a comparison over the seasons, over the entire year between 91, 92, and 2015, 2016.
Okay, there is another question. Thanks a lot for that response. I hope it satisfies the...
Our chapter, she's from...
or at least, yes, we can catch up on it later in case she's not satisfied. Does hot and intense fire increase possibility of alien plant entities for species that get stimulated with fire or by fire?
So the information that we have, and especially on the experimental burn plots, which is a 67-year experiment that we have a range of fire intensity from the extreme, very high fire intensities all the way to cooler. We have not seen an increase in invasive species. So no, we have not seen that. We have not seen that these experiments go right from our high rainfall area, 700 mils, all the way to about 350 mils in Mokani in the north of the park. And really, in each of those plots, with the increase in fire intensities, we have not seen colonization by invasive species.
Okay. We had also encouraged people to raise their hands. I can't see if anyone has raised their hand, but I'll continue reading the questions out until someone raises their hand, and then they can engage with Navashini directly. Peter Botha, I think is from Limpopo, judging from the question asked. He's saying fire and goats were used at Toowoomba Research Station to great success. Does the Kruger National Park have any bush encroachment problem, and where?
So yes, we are seeing densification of our woody vegetation, and we're seeing that specifically on our granites. So more than half of the park, when you look at fixed point photographs from back in the day, earlier on compared to now, we definitely are seeing, as I've shown the pictures of the death of savannahs, we are seeing an increase in woody vegetation, and this is indigenous vegetation, Cactus, Terminalia, Combretum species. So we are seeing that, and I must say we know that goats can be used, but I don't think we're going to be able to use domestic animals in the park. But as I said, we would like to manipulate or use fire and herbivory in combination, but we need to understand what size of fires we need to concentrate our herbivores. Because once you burn an area, you attract, the green flush will attract the game. So if we can not dilute the effect of the grazers, then we will try and use combinations of fire and herbivory to address the bush thickening. But we are seeing it, and it's mostly on our granites that we are seeing an increase in bush thickening or woody encroachment in the park.
Okay. Let me check if there's any hand. No hand. Okay. This one comes from I think the Cape. Do you still ignite prescribed burns in the Kruger National Park? What is the current ratio of prescribed burns to wildfires?
Yes, we do ignite prescribed burns. As I say, our legislation prohibits it, but we are a fire protection association, and we've got exemption from that particular clause, and we're trying to now amend the legislation to allow for more prescribed burns. So we do light our fires. What's at the current ratio? We would like to have more fires lit by our fire managers, that we have more control and we can decide where, when, and how we are lighting the fires. At the moment, we have much more areas burnt in wildfires. When I say wildfires, these are fires that we don't have control. They're coming from our neighbors across the boundary and stuff. And that's because we get these fires in our dry season. So you can have one fire that burns 10,000 hectares, where you can have put in 100 ignition points, in the green, in the wet season, and you have much area, much less burn. So we do like prescribed fires. We're seeing more area burnt in the wildfires, but we would like to reclaim that now and have much more control. And that's what we are doing by putting in more prescribed burning in early season to break up the fuel load. That is our aim.
Okay. And Mike Peel from Nelspruit, a colleague of mine, first is saying, hi Navashini, lovely talk as always. From the first disclosure peak, it seems that elephant is really important in keeping the landscape open. In combination with fire, that didn't seem to be the case in the Satara. I think plot peak. Any comment there, if you got his point?
Yeah, so the exclosure was to show where we took herbivory out of the picture, and we saw this increase, although fire was still a driver in both areas, the fenced and unfenced area. We saw an increase, though, in the woody vegetation. And then we saw the same taking place in the experimental burn plot, where we pulled fire out, and you had herbivores were also allowed to be in both areas. So what I tried to illustrate there, that we need to understand where we are applying a fire management plan or a particular fire treatment, and realize that when we fence or have unfenced areas, it does play a role in what we are seeing and stuff. So I just think that so the reason why is I want to demonstrate that there is a very strong interaction between fire and herbivory in shaping and what we're seeing in the landscape. So you can't have one policy in isolation. You need to have combined both policies, and how you're managing your elephants or herbivory, and in our case, it's dominated by elephants, and a fire policy.
Okay. And Anno here is asking, which months do you consider early season for cooler fires? Changing to cooler fires early in the season compared to hot fires late in the season?
Okay, so in the where we are in the eastern part of the country, we have our peak fire season in our drier months or winters, and that's usually we start in, say, July, August, September. We have our cooler fires in our wetter months, and if we can get a hot fire in these months, maybe November, December, January, when it is the growing season, that is really what we would like to achieve. So our hot fires and our peak fire season, drier months, August, September, October, and then cooler fires in the growing season, wetter months, December, January, February.
Yeah. Okay, maybe before I ask you another question, I see one hand from Peter Porter who would like to engage with you directly. Peter, over to you. Just unmute, and then you ask your question or make your comment. Try and make it as straight to the point as possible.
Good day. Nice talk. I really appreciate it. Thanks, you guys. Navashini, just a little thought. The combination of fire and potential impacts on the wetlands in KNP. Has there any thought been given on what the impacts are on wetlands, or whether wetlands have got a different requirement for fire?
Yeah, I mean, we really looked at fire and wetlands in our national parks, like where we have true wetlands in Marikele. In the Kruger National Park, we really have more seeps and flays rather than true wetlands. But yes, fire does play a role. I mean, if the fires are too frequent, you can have the drying up of the landscape and the effect on the soil. So, to manage on a scale of individual wetlands and areas in an area of the Kruger National Park is really quite difficult. So we will have a particular principle that we would like to use. And, we're looking at fire management zones that are much larger but we do take that into account. So areas like the Malachaklanga Springs or further north in the park where we're seeing these flays, the way we implement fires in those landscapes is the effects that it has on wetlands, or in Kruger, more likely flays and springs, we do take that into account.
Okay, looks like we have more questions than the time we have available to ask. Let me to this one from Jim. So you set minimum and maximum grass fuel load and humidity percentage for prescribed bands. Is asking if you said you had any set minimum and maximum grass fuel loads and humidity percentages for prescribed bands.
Okay, so essentially how we in a nutshell, how we run the fire policy in the Kruger National Park is we look at, because of the very strong relationship we have between the preceding 2 years rainfall and how much needs to burn in a particular fire season, we use that to determine the amount that needs to burn. So the more rain you have, the more grass, the more fires you will have. So that's we determine how much we need to burn. And what we've done now in the Kruger National Park is we've divided the park into 5 fire management zones. Each zone receives a fire treatment that really is affecting the ecological status of that area, meaning that if we are in an area that we would like to change the grass species composition, or we want to influence tree densities, we will allow for a certain fire to take place or a certain fire intensity. So a section ranger or a section needs to determine where they are in a zone that's identified, and then what is the fire intensity or frequency that is required to meet certain obligations or deliverables with using fire as the tool. So as I said, if you're in an area that requires high intensity frequent fires, and then you need to burn 20%, that's what you need to do as a section ranger. But you have now been told how much you need to burn. You've now been told the season of burn, and we know when you get these high intensity or cooler burns. Now the section ranger, or which is usually the manager on the ground, needs to go and put in the fires in there. So that's how we determine or implement the fire policy in Kruger.
Okay. Navashini, maybe let's just say that a number of colleagues here first start their questions by complimenting your presentation. I must say it was a great job done. And here earlier on, someone asked about whether you have seen any responses in terms of your alien invasive plants. And there's a comment here from the Western Cape saying that there is evidence from African protected areas that fire can be used to control alien species in some cases, but in other cases, fire encourages the spread of aliens. It varies from species to species. So using or avoiding fire will depend on the target alien plant species.
Yeah, I agree with that, because in areas such as in KZN, where we are seeing Chromalina and taking over the landscape there, fire is definitely a tool. And once again, working on fire, and Winston Collins have shown that
you are now disappearing and appearing. You are not constant in audibility.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you better now. Yes.
Okay, so yes, I agree with that statement, because we've seen that in areas in KZN where fire is a very effective management tool to address Chromalina in those landscapes. In the Kruger Park with the invasive species, we seem to be dominated by water invasive species, so in our rivers, and now recently with famine weed, and we haven't looked at fire as a tool to address famine weed. We've moved going on to biocontrol. We're very lucky that we don't seem to have many terrestrial invasive species vegetation.
Okay, great. And here is a question from Dr. Fermark, and he's also complimenting your talk, and also is saying the topic is very interesting and it merits more attention. How do you see a stronger integration of the Kruger National Park fire policy of controlled fires with management practices in the APNR? I hope you know what APNR is.
It's the adjoining private nature reserves. So,
okay.
And how do we see us integrating? We are very much integrated, because we sit together on the Fire Protection Association. So we talk regularly with regards to what fires and how we should be burning and how we should be managing this in our two areas. So there is very, very strong interaction and learning between the two areas. So that integration between Kruger and the APNR is taking place. Maybe we need more, but it is taking place.
Okay. Okay. The question from Gambiza, James Gambiza, if I'm not mistaken, is from Rhodes University, if it has not changed. In first, is also starting with a comment that it was a great talk indeed. What is the average fire return interval for different vegetation types, if you have that information?
Yes, so it really depends on the soil, rainfall, and then the vegetation type, lastly, that we get different fire return periods. So in our high rainfall granite areas, 1 to 2 years of high return period. So that's in our southwest areas where we have high rainfall above 680, 700 mils, and on our granites, very, very frequent fires. And we would encourage more hotter fires in that area. As we go north into the park, the fire return period decreases. And in our areas along our basalts and much drier landscapes, we're seeing a fire return period dominated by about 3 to 5 years. So it really depends on rainfall as well as the soils that drives the fire return period. I mean, there's some areas or fire management zones that we have that we're calling the wilderness fire management zones. Those areas haven't received fires in more than 20, 25 years. So there's longer time intervals, especially along our drainage lines areas. So it does vary, but rainfall and soils are the two factors that drive
that. Okay. Alessandra Fidelis asked, first started by also saying great talk. Have you seen any changes in burned areas of fire behavior after the drought of 2015 and 16 in the Kruger? And if yes, how long could you see this effect?
So after the 2015 or during the 2015-2016 drought and then the subsequent year, where we saw a change in the fire behavior was we're a lot less, as I said, rainfall determines the amount that burns. So because we're in a drought, we had a lot less areas that was available to burn or forage to burn fuel. But what we did see is that we had a greater fire risk in our camps. So it was really quite interesting. The camped areas or the areas that was in our rest camps and where people were, we saw much higher fire risk because now there was a lot of vegetation in there, no herbivory, and the vegetation was dry. So that was a much higher fire risk. And then from an infrastructure and safety point of view, we needed to address that. Going onwards, we haven't seen, now that we've gone through a period of really good rains, and especially with Cyclone Eloise here, we are predicting a humdinger of a fire season this year where the fuel has been extensive. The recovery fuel load has increased and we're seeing good cover as well. So we are definitely going to have a good rainfall, a good fire season because of the good rains that we have after the drought.
Okay, I've been encouraging colleagues to also raise their hand. It looks like one colleague, Chilavo, has raised his. Let's give him a chance to ask a question or make a comment, and try and make it as short and straight to the point as possible. Please unmute yourself and make your contribution.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes, thank you.
Great talk, Navashini. Thank you so much for that. Good to see you. So yes. You said to maintain the grassland, so we need a correlation between mega herbivory and the fire. But in a case like Madagascar, where we don't have any herbivory anymore, but we recently proved that the grassland in Madagascar are ancient. So what can we do to maintain those grasslands without the herbivory?
So yeah, Slavo, it was nice coming out to Madagascar.
You got the essence of the question.
I think so, and I think it was nice going out there and seeing the grasslands in the highlands there and stuff. And I think we really need to bring fire back into the system because it is now getting encroached with woody species. And I think in Madagascar, where fire is very much criminalized, that people are not willing to put in the fires to maintain that system. So I think if we want to maintain good, healthy grasslands that have evolved with fires, we need to bring fire back into the system. But I think what we need to determine there is at what frequency and at what intensity, because I think that will definitely vary from areas based on elevation and available rainfall. So I advocate for more fire, Slavo, as we said, but we have to look at the intensity and also then the frequency of burning if you want to maintain healthy grasslands.
You happy with that, sir? Okay, I assume that that's consent. Okay. There is also a comment from Dr. Fermark. It's also agreeing with the notion that maybe fire can be used to manage or control invasive plants, and he's saying they have had success in total destruction of stubble seed using fire, and he's very excited about that. I don't know if you know the plant and you have any comment there.
No, I don't know the plant.
Okay, but at least it goes to support the notion that it is on where you are and the conditions prevailing where you are. Now, Peter, just as a matter of interest, from where do most rogue fires enter the park? South Africa side or Mozambique side? Do fires have a natural movement east to west or north south? Interesting question.
Yeah, so I think I think we get our fires from both sides. So as long as a fire doesn't stop at a fence, if there is a fence, and it's just a matter of people setting fires and then allowing it to get out of control. So we get fires from both sides. At some stage when I first got here early in 2001, and there was always this thing about arson fire or fire started by people walking through the park. And I think when there was significant movement of people from Mozambique into the park, then yes, we used to get a lot of fires started by people in the park traveling from from Mozambique into South Africa. So yeah, I think as long as there's people, we will have lots of fires. We would like to have our rangers setting most of the fires in the Kruger National Park, because that shows that we can decide on the day and when we want to light the fires, and so we have a bit more control over the actual burning. And fires have natural movement east to west or north to south. Depends on the wind. I'm not sure. Fires, it burns throughout the park. I can't know how to answer that question.
Okay, that's good enough. And there's this question now, just before we hand over to Debbie. There is this question from Paulina, and it says, what is the natural seasonal timing of fires in Kruger? That is, when do lightning ignite fires? How close are your management practices to this pattern?
Okay. So in the Kruger National Park, we have adopted that not only lightning is a natural ignition source, man is a natural ignition source. This area has evolved with fire, started by man for whatever reason for millennia. So we really have put the ball into our court in saying that man is a natural ignition source. But when it comes to lightning fires is really not dominant in the Kruger National Park. We've looked at that, at the number of lightning strikes and how often they do result in the fires. So even when we had our 10 years of a policy, when we said we will only allow lightning fires to be the dominant ignition source, during that time period, more than 75% of the fires that was lit in the Kruger National Park was started by man, whatever reason, rangers, people walking through the park. So lightning is not a very significant ignition source in the Kruger. When we do have the odd lightning fire, it usually is on our granite areas, but they don't burn extensive areas. So just to answer that question, we really do consider man as a natural ignition source, and that's what we have done.
Okay. Maybe before I hand over to Debbie for her to make some closing remarks, I noticed that there's this part of the talk that I haven't seen any question on that I would like to find out about. You just before you ended, you were talking about reforestation and then how different countries are advocating for it, and then also you presented some evidence against it, especially in our case in South Africa. I was curious about whether you have any idea of what sort of basis the other part of the coin are using for it.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that has really been advocated in the last very recent times, where trying to offset carbon emissions, where we allow for the planting of trees and wooded vegetation to allow for that carbon sink. And yes, there is a time and place for that, and it is needed. So we're not saying that areas that are degraded need to be reforested or rehabilitated. But the problem that we have, or what we're seeing, is that when you run a model that shows the Kruger National Park and the Serengeti as a degraded landscape, because it's not at its maximum woody cover, and we don't consider savannas and grassland as a productive landscape, that is a problem. So I think that is the basic idea. Indeed, there are areas, we need to go to those areas and also plant the right species. I mean, advocating fast-growing species like eucalypts and pines to reforest those areas bring a whole suite of other problems. So I think that the principle is correct, or it's just the implementation of it that's incorrect. And I think we take great offense when Kruger comes out as a degraded landscape and needs to be reforested. So I think that's what we need to work and engage with our politicians and parties to say, we can use this as gaining carbon credits and offset carbon emissions, but it's really for the benefit of biodiversity and the well-being in the country. We need to really look at where and what species we are planting.
Okay, our last question comes from Freak, who's asking if early humans are mimicked in terms of starting fires. Should they also be mimicked in terms of other conservation management issues such as resource use?
Hello, Freak. Good to see you. Good to hear from you. I absolutely agree with that. I think if we are going to mimic the role that man has played in lighting fires, resource consumption and sustainable resource use in order to allow for the persistence of our protected areas needs to be taken up. And we need to now not be afraid and, not allow for the sustainable resource use for resources in protected areas, because we are in a game of conservation and benefits for people, and rather than just preservation. So I agree, and I think we should be doing that for other resources.
Okay, that wraps this session. From me, Navashini, I would like to thank you for having responded to those questions so gracefully. And just before I hand over to Debbie, Gustav is also recommending a video. I think I've seen it on YouTube by William Bond on open ecosystem, discusses some of the issues that we were covered here. So he's encouraging people to also look at that video. Over to you, Debbie. Thank you very much again, Navashini.
My pleasure.
And Tutuka, thanks very much for handling those questions and answers, and you as well, Navashini. You certainly had a barrage of questions, but it just shows how wide a topic this is and the interest in the topic. And clearly, it's not a simple topic to deal with. It's very complex and it's very scale dependent as to what is appropriate, especially when human lives and infrastructure is at stake as well. And yes, I definitely agree. The whole issue of reforestation is certainly cause for concern on multiple fronts. And yeah, the species they are recommending it just makes the blood curdle with that. But thank you so much for your very interesting presentation on such a burning topic. We appreciate your time and your expertise on this, so thank you very much. And with that, we will be having our next webinar session, Sundowner webinar, in a month's time. I'm not familiar with the topic offhand, but watch your inboxes. We will let you know what that new topic is. And thank you all very much for your time and questions. Have a great evening further. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.